So I was asked to deliver this address on the south end of the battlefield, and I took the topic with a degree of trepidation because I wasn't really sure what to talk about. But I had a vague memory of the mid-90s when I had a friend who's now at Roanoke Island National Park who had led me probably illegally on a crossing of Snavely's Ford. And from that point, we retraced the route of the 9th New York. And that story of the regiment, some of the imagery that we'll be talking about this evening, had always captivated me. And so when the invitation came, I thought immediately about that charge. And this was all sort of new research and new material, which is some of the most fun work that I can do as a historian. And I think there's some interesting interpretations that the regiment lent to this experience on the battlefield. So we're going to work through this experience through two lenses. We're going to think about the events themselves on the 17th of September. I'm going to give you some background information on the unit, a bit of its service record, especially in North Carolina. And then from there, we'll rehearse the charge itself, and then most importantly, how it came to be remembered by the survivors of that regiment. It's actually a pretty contested event in many other minds' eye. And it has sort of farther reaching ideas about McClellan's performance on that day. And so I'm not going to delve too deeply into that, but I am going to touch upon it a bit. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get underway. We'll probably fall in this wire at some point today. Just get it. Okay. So let me start here with the scene that you see before you. The tattered silk flag of the 9th New York, also known as Hawkins Zouaves, was emblazoned with the logo Toujours Pret, or always ready. And these words indeed rung true on September the 17th, 1862. In the late afternoon, as part of the 9th Corps assault, men of the 9th New York surged through shot and shell across the undulating terrain that you yourselves have walked this very day, eventually to the crest of what was the Harpers Ferry Road, to then push back Confederate infantry. At the apex of the assault, a 22-year-old French-born captain, Adolphe Libaire of Company E, seized the colors, urged the Zouaves forward, saying, "Up, damn you," and forward. He yelled it, and it surprised the men because he was known as a modest, quiet individual. It shocked them out of their complacency because the attack itself had stalled. Fiercely waving the flag above his head, many of the regiment then followed, and quite remarkably, Libaire, despite the near hailstorm of bullets, was not himself hit. On that day, the 9th New York will suffer over 60% casualties, but they were emboldened by this act of determination and courage. The Zouaves' assault became the stuff of legend. Wartime artist Edwin Forbes, many of you know his work, immortalized the charge in this extraordinarily popular and often reproduced sketch. Libaire himself was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1898 for his actions at Antietam. Yet for many of the survivors of the 9th, they viewed this event with a degree of frustration. One charged that, quote, "A golden opportunity had been wasted, and the 9th Corps had been prevented from winning its richly deserved laurels." There's a surprising contradiction that emerges between history and memory. And this will really form the basis of tonight's presentation. Despite the recent revitalization of George B. McClellan's tarnished reputation, one interpretation that I embrace, nonetheless, an old assessment offered by none other than Gary Gallagher will at least ring true with some. And Gallagher charged, quote, "McClellan had squandered priceless openings between the 16th and the 18th of September 1862 because he, quote, ultimately lacked the fortitude to let his loyal soldiers seek complete victory. Now, I will say, offering these words among the field guides, I'm very brave to do so. And so they're probably ready to throw me out, but just bear with me here. Because I'm not going to enter this arena of McClellan's reputation, but what I'll do instead is I'll come at it sideways. Because it is very clear that the Zouaves themselves understood their leadership and understood this day in a very specific way. Antietam was, by any measure, a watershed moment because of its fury. And although the 9th could boast of a long, storied reputation throughout its regiment's history, the experiences at Antietam were almost unparalleled, despite perhaps, or barring perhaps, one moment in February of 1862 at Roanoke Island. But even in that instance, they suffered fewer casualties and the victory had been utterly complete. And while McClellan does meet a military victory on the 17th of September, Lee's army is repulsed on the 18th. Many of the observers in the 9th Corps more broadly, but the 9th New York specifically, felt as though his army should have been crushed in the late hours of the 17th. And many of these points, should come as no surprise. The south end of the field is one of the most contested in the memory of Antietam. Take, for instance, the raging debates over the timing of the assault on Burnside's Bridge. Did McClellan deliver the orders at 8? Was it 10:10? Was it 9:10? These were debated actively among Cox, McClellan, and Burnside deep into the post-battle and post-war period. The 9th struggled to understand the extent of their losses and the meaning of that assault, which is emblematic, I think, for some of the larger troubles the main people have had in assessing the action on the south end of the field. Lieutenant Matthew J. Graham, who will figure very prominently in tonight's assault, lost his leg on the south end of the field, wounded on that dreadful day. It served both as a source of pride and as a source of frustration. His military service became entwined with his post-war life, culminating not only in the monument dedication, which we'll talk about later on this evening, but also the 1900 publication of the regimental history for the 9th. Recalling that day, Graham noted, quote, grievous errors which caused their withdrawal from its advanced and hard-won position. Like many survivors, he grimly surmised that their devotion to duty had been wasted and the lives of so many of their comrades sacrificed for naught. The survivors of the 9th New York came to understand their assault both as a triumphal charge, but also as a pure victory. Okay, so we're going to go back in time. Going to rehearse a bit about the unit's history, get some rhythm, understand perhaps some of the psychology that was shaping the soldiers on that day of September the 17th, and why these individuals are sort of unique militarily in terms of their uniforms and so forth. So the 9th New York is mustered into service on April the 23rd, 1861 in New York City. They swear their oath on May the 4th. And they are led by this man pictured here, Rush Hawkins. Interestingly too, 5 Dahlgren boat howitzers were attached to the company and will be present at Antietam, but not figure too heavily into the charge that we're going to be talking about here later on. The nucleus of the 9th New York was the so-called Old Company, and they were known as the New York Zouaves. And it's going to be the Zouave uniform or costume that we'll talk about here in a minute, but by wearing this uniform, the 9th New York enters into this larger sort of craze that swept Europe and the Americas in the 1850s and the 1860s, mimicking elite French troops. The 9th will spend time at Castle Green and eventually be moved to Rikers Island, which is not what it is today. Before departing New York City, they will proudly march down Fifth Avenue. And there will be 2 presentations, one of the red silk flag with the motto, always present, and also another presentation of the national colors. And the ceremonies are emblematic of the ones that you would see time and time again throughout these communities in the spring and summer of 1861. The exchange of lofty words and great promises. One of the presenters saying that this Union flag is the emblem of our established fathers and that its cost was paid in the price of blood. It's a sacred oath. Colonel Hawkins, for his part, swore that he would never surrender the flag except with his life's blood. And the entire regiment was pledged to stand by it at any cost and to bring it back unsullied by any taint of dishonor. So remember those words. They're going to be prophetic when we get to the afternoon of the 17th. We won't go into this too deeply, but it is worth making a note here of why this Zouave uniform was so popular and why the 9th decided to adopt it as its official uniform. So after the Crimean War, French Zouaves had achieved really an international reputation for their bravery and for their skill on the battlefield. In 1830, the French Army first introduces the Zouave uniform for military action in Algeria, and the initial concept was actually to use native soldiers, but the idea never took hold, and so instead, European soldiers wear these outfits that are sort of a fantasy of a Berber dress. And they really stand in contrast to what the regulation dress was of the United States Army in this pre-war Civil War era. Tightly fitted frock coats, sort of stiff, long, elaborate hats, uniforms that didn't allow for a lot of probably easy movement, but instead ensured the regulation of posture and pose for a soldier. The Zouaves dress, by contrast, was meant to facilitate fast movement, quick action, and what the 9th eventually adopts is largely the Zouave dress with what's called a sort of chasseur variation. Instead of the large baggy pantaloons the 5th New York became notable for, these pants are a little more sort of trimmed in or fit. But this is indeed the uniform that they wore ad Antietam, but as we will see, a lot of the iconography will feature sort of a broader idea of Zouave dress during this era. But this is ultimately the uniform of the 9th, and it is really, again, part of this sort of broader trend and broader craze that existed during this period. And this is a surviving uniform of the 9th New York. Now, for the soldiers themselves, really the spring of 1861 marks their entry into military service. And we're really fortunate in that one of the members of the 9th New York, Charles Johnson, is a prolific diarist. So we have this incredible account of really the daily life of the soldiers of the 9th throughout much of the wartime era. Many of the accounts that I'll use for the charge itself are derived from Johnson, and some of them are also from the post-war writings of Graham, among others. But for these men, the day is long. It starts at 4 a.m. They have constant exercise under arms until fatigue. They mount the guard. They drill in the afternoon. Tattoo comes at 8, taps come at 8:30. And while this is monotonous, this drill will be absolutely essential, as we'll see, when the men of the 9th are put into extraordinarily difficult positions, both at Roanoke and then later at South Mountain and then Antietam. And indeed, the first instances of service, of really hard military service, come for the 9th when they're going to experience a change of base. And they will eventually, in the winter of 1862, join Ambrose Burnside's North Carolina Expeditionary Corps, and they will soon see extraordinarily fierce fighting. Indeed, along the swampy coastlines of the Old North States, the men of the 9th will be baptized by fire. And the most important position that they will have to carry is that of Roanoke Island. Roanoke Island is a heavily fortified Confederate position. It's central to defending some of the waterways in and around the Croatoan Sound, and the Zouaves are going to be critical in carrying that position on February the 8th. For his part, Charles Johnson, his first taste of battle, is extraordinarily concerned and even sickened by the prospect of war. He wrote of the, quote, sickening sensation as if I was going to a slaughterhouse to be butchered. And as we neared the field and saw ominous shapes here and there, the Zouaves soon encountered bodies wrapped in blankets, too deathly still for sleep. A cold shudder passes over Johnson. Bowing to the dictates of 19th century culture, Johnson grapples with these conflicted feelings, but he soon recovers, writing that, quote, I cannot believe that I was cowardly for these thoughts, for I know that no such idea as escape entered my mind. He knew he would stay firm to his comrades. I was simply walking into the jaws of death for the first time, made more horrible by the sights and sounds around me, and I felt I must be deathly pale. But then Johnson has a realization. He knows that the men around him are experiencing the exact same emotions. They too are gripped by the exact same fear. And it's that esprit de corps that was built on Rikers Island, in all of the monotonous training in and around New York City, is going to bond these men together so tightly, and it's going to ensure their successes on the 8th of February. And as I alluded to earlier, the tinted lithograph that you see before you has played around a bit with the coloring scheme. You see this sort of time and time again. The more familiar sort of baggy red pants that feature so prominently among the French infantry in Algeria and during Crimea, the ones the 5th New York wore at Gaines's Mill, are placed here on the bodies of the 9th New York soldiers, inaccurately, but you don't need to worry too much about that. Hawkins, for his part, proves himself an extraordinarily capable leader. The regiment is given the orders to fix bayonets, and this was done, according to one account, in a gallant style. The enemy's works were soon carried, and the position hastily abandoned by the rebels. Interestingly, Hawkins projects sort of a democratic ethos in his after-action report, saying that essentially all officers and all men behaved with a gallantry and a bravery. It is impossible to say who is the more deserving or who merits the most applause. And this democratic ethos was actually very apparent in his pre-war company as well. They had these very sort of strict guidelines and ideas as to how the regiment was to behave and comport itself. So it's sort of just an interesting concept in this democratic era that he lived in. Now I'll get our narrative moving here because we got to get to Antietam. And so, I actually won't go to it. Okay, we'll fast forward. So really by early September, as you all know, you're a knowledgeable audience here. McClellan, of course, is in pursuit of Lee. Hawkins is going to go on leave. So he's actually not going to be with the regiment during the Maryland campaign. And instead, Lieutenant Colonel Edgar Addison Kimball will be placed in charge. And Kimball, for his part, is a veteran of Mexico. He's a veteran now with the 9th at Roanoke Island. He's a trusted leader. This is key. Kevin earlier today talked about a leadership change in the 4th Rhode Island. Am I correct, Kevin? Yeah. That create a lot of consternation among members of the regiment. In this case, they're being placed in extraordinarily capable hands at one of the most important points in the regiment's history. And so Kimball is going to lead the men during the Maryland campaign, and they will soon see some very light action at South Mountain, at Fox's Gap, but it's again extraordinarily light. Soon the 9th New York is in pursuit of the rebel army. They cross the Little Antietam Creek near Keysville, and then they ford another small stream near Locust Spring. The 9th will stop on the 15th at Red Hill. No wagons are to be found, no food is available. The men will ultimately sleep on empty stomachs. September the 16th is a day of anticipation. There's sharp skirmishing on portions of the battlefield, especially on the north end and near the east woods. Artillery is in place. Shots are being exchanged. Both sides know a significant action is on the horizon. The men of the 9th think that action will start in the late afternoon around 5 p.m. on the 16th. The men are ordered to fix bayonets. They start to move forward, expecting significant Confederate resistance, and think that they are going to meet their foes on the 16th. Eventually, they learn they're nowhere near the Confederate lines, and Rodman ultimately puts them in a position to the far rear. But, as we'll talk about, in a very exposed position, but they don't go into this encampment until late at night, probably around 10 or 11. David Thompson of Company G wrote that all through the evening, there was the shifting and placing of men, the moving of masses, only dimly described in the strange half-lights of earth and sky. By 11 p.m., the regiment sets down for an uneasy rest. And again, it's so dark at this point that they're not entirely clear as to where their position is, only to discover at dawn that they're in an open, exposed field immediately visible to Confederate artillery. And so almost at first light, the regiment is bombarded and very quickly is moved to a different spot. By about 10:30 a.m., the division is moved off to the high ridges that loom above the lower bridge or Burnside Bridge. They travel about 1,000 yards below the lower bridge, and they end up at a large bend, often called Old Ford. It's where the water course changes slightly. And the first supposition is that this is where they're going to make their crossing. The 9th will not cross across the bridge, but instead they're looking for a fordable, navigable area. Those 5 Dahlgren boat howitzers are deployed along a ridge, and the regiment is soon under attack from Confederate skirmishers, members of the 50th Georgia. Around 1 p.m., it's decided that the first ford is not practicable, and they instead turn to Snavely's Ford, the site that you're going to visit tomorrow. They're crossing around 1 p.m. The 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania are making their assault at this time. The men can hear the fierce firefight about 1,200 yards above them. They can see the black smoke bellowing in the air. They can hear the crash of artillery. And they themselves start meeting small arms fire. David Thompson writes that as one man in the 9th is crossing Snavely's Ford, he's immediately hit in the water. Very quickly, the regiment makes its way across Snavely's Ford to grounds that is absolutely remarkable for how difficult it is. And so I had the great good fortune this summer with Mike Fernie, one of your fellow participants, to walk across this ground. I've been across it many times, but it was good to have an expert with me. And then later on this fall, I also walked with Brian, one of your speakers last night. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to intersperse some contemporary images with period images to give you some sense of the terrain, a lot of which you have seen today, but some of which you won't see until tomorrow, or you might not get on the tour itself. Because it is extraordinarily daunting and extraordinarily arduous. And indeed, Lieutenant Graham writes that the Zouaves marched, or rather climbed, directly up this bluff, and the ground was extraordinarily rough and extraordinarily difficult. Ultimately, it's a very hard position to ascend, but they do it quite quickly and quite efficiently. Now, you have heard throughout the course of the past day and a half largely what the plan was at the south end of the field. So I will just briefly say that Jacob Cox knows that time is of the essence. Every minute that is wasted enables those rebel troops across the Harpers Ferry Road to bring in more artillery, to bring in more ammunition for the small arms fire, to bolster their position. And so it is absolutely crucial that they mount successfully this assault, but it is done so in an organized and concerted fashion because the land on the south end of the field is extraordinarily difficult by any measure. It's undulating and it obscures portions on the horizon. Whereas the ground that they will cross, as we'll see from a post-Civil War photograph, is largely open, thereby exposing them to incessant artillery fire throughout the early afternoon of the 17th. It's extraordinarily difficult. And the Confederate position that we're talking about are those guns either on, such as Richardson's Harpers Ferry Road, or those of Brown that have been moved forward of the Harpers Ferry Road. And for those of you on the walks today, we came across this very ground that is pictured here. As the 9th Corps is preparing their assault, there was approximately 22 rebel guns on that ridge line, and as Jim Ruthbach and I talked about earlier, it will eventually get to about 40 guns. The Union guns, protecting members of Fairchild's Brigade and the 9th, 10 Parrott rifles. So there's an imbalance there. For the members of the 9th and the 900 plus men in Fairchild's Brigade, the first thing that they must endure is that artillery fire. I apologize. I used a piece of the Hope painting, not appropriate to the place on the field, but it gives you an image, of course, of the Confederate artillerymen. Kimball described the shelling as, quote, unmerciful. It was a fire of shot and shell. Lieutenant Graham, for his part, is lying on his back, watching the shells burst above him. At one point, he thinks that he can put his finger up, and he waits to see how long it will be until it's hit. He, quote, speculates until how long it will take until it's shot off. Graham is worried. This artillery bombardment is fierce. The men haven't experienced anything like this. The ground that you walked across today is open. Right on the reverse slope, where Clark and Durrell's guns are stationed, offers some modicum of protection, but not a lot. And as these shells come in, Graham sees Kimball, the commander of the 9th, moving among the men, seemingly getting ready for some sort of action. And Graham thinks to himself, there's no way we could ever be ordered to assault this position, given that Confederate artillery. He thinks that Kimball might be mad. Yet at that moment, Kimball looks directly at Graham, and he yells the command, "Get up the 9th." And with that, the enlisted men stood up. David Thompson, one of the foot soldiers in the 9th, said that the prospect was far from encouraging, but the order came to get up and get ready for the attempt. The Zouaves soon form on the reverse military slope of that ridge where Clark and Durrell's guns are, and they start to prepare for their work. They discard their knapsacks to allow them to move with more efficiency. Very quickly, one company is pulled from each regiment in Fairchild's brigade to be distributed as skirmishers. For the men are now under small arms fire from advanced Confederate infantry along the lower stone wall of the 7th Virginia. And Charles Johnson, that prolific diarist that I talked about, is one of the men who joins the skirmish line. The skirmishers dash over the ridge, quickly moving into the auto farm lane. Then they move into Sherrick's plowed fields, extending some 300 yards, where to their distance are those skirmishers of the 7th Virginia. The men generally reloading on the ground, being protected as long as they could before they stood up to pop a shot off at the enemy. Johnson at one point begins to panic. His cartridges seem not to be working. Why? Because water had infiltrated his cartridge box when they forded at Snavely's Ford. Many men in the skirmish line are beginning to discover the exact same thing. The very tools that they need to fight this battle have been fouled by the conditions of the creek crossing. There's a call for ammunition to come up, but before they decide to do so, the situation is starting to change. And at some point, Johnson is going to observe something that proves extraordinarily unsettling. He will see a solid shot, quote, like an India rubber ball, crashing through the air over our heads with a noise that could only be likened to a savage yell of some inhuman monster. Lieutenant Graham, for his part, writes that the shells came slowly and deliberately, and apparently appeared with no harm until they hit something around them. And so again, there's an uptick now in the firing, and the situation is becoming more and more tense. The men of the 9th now come up. Sorry. The men of the 9th form beyond the ridge line behind Clark and Durrell's guns, preparing themselves for the assault. They very quickly cross the auto farm lane, first ascending the first fence line and then the second. By the time they get to the second fence line, no longer here, because the park's going to be replacing those and doing a controlled burn, the regiment becomes disorganized. And in Jim Rosebach's sort of configuration, this is the first step of 3 steps or ascents that the regiment is going to have to make over the course of about 900 yards to ultimately get to that Confederate position. And at this point, the men, quote, hurried forward to a shallow undulation a few feet ahead, and they began to lay down because the artillery fire above them had become so great. Kimball, for his part, starts running up and down the lines, encouraging the men. Keep your head down for now, but prepare. Soon we're going to be moving. He's shown himself to be an extraordinarily courageous figure in the midst, again, of this incessant shelling that is proving to be so deadly. At one point, David Thompson of Company G looks behind him, and he sees a man riding as though he's riding in a rainstorm, clinging to the neck of his horse, moving along. And then between this rider and another man, he encounters a soldier with a rolled up overcoat and straps that bound into the air and fell into a shallow cliff. One of the enemy's grape shot had plowed a groove in the skull of the young fellow and had cut his overcoat from his shoulders. Charles Johnson, for his part, is still in the skirmish line. He sees yet more artillery. He calls the projectiles deafening with their death cry. In one frightful scene, off in the distance, he sees a shell hit a man, severed his limbs completely from his body. If I could have heard him shriek, it would not have been so horrible, Johnson wrote. But to see him seize at his limbs, without being able to catch a sound from him, oh God, may I never be doomed to witness such a sight again. The Zouaves, for their part, start to reform on the other side of the auto lane, getting ready for this surge forward. File closers order the men to tighten up. Officers move up and down the rear rank, putting men into line, telling them to muster their strength, to muster their courage, to prepare what's ultimately ahead of them. They begin to move forward across sheriff's plowed fields. In a second, quote, the air was full of hisses of bullets and the hurtle of grape shots. The strain began to tell in a remarkable image. I'll go back to that. David Thompson writes, quote, at that moment, a singular effect mentioned, I think, in the life of Goethe on a similar occasion. The whole landscape for an instant turned slightly red. A landscape turned red. Now, for the fields themselves, the park has done a remarkable job in the curation thereof and the rehabilitation. But it is important to note, and Mike Froning provided me with this image, that if you're looking to the south and to the east, picture where you were earlier today on Kevin's tour when he talked about the 4th Rhode Island, the areas beyond the 16th Connecticut Monument picture here, and this is all a vast woodlot. We're looking instead at a view shed that demonstrates how clear most of these areas are. These are cultivated fields. The Carmen Cope maps reinforce that idea, and again just gives voice to the terror that many of these men must have felt as they're moving along what is very much open and exposed terrain for large portions of the assault. It just heightens the terror that many of the men feel. And while today is not perfectly rehabilitated, this gives you a good view of the line of the assault of the 9th New York. This is a clearing that the park has recently created for the controlled burn that's forthcoming, and this is hanging up to the area of Branch Avenue. So again, it gives you some sense of the undulation, gives you some sense of the ups and downs. And in fact, D.H. Hill, watching this assault, thinks that at one point his artillery has proven so effective that it has shattered Fairchild's brigade because the men disappear. What Hill is witnessing is the men descending into one of the deep swells, this one potentially right here, that's still several hundred yards away from the Confederate artillery, where they're now entirely out of sight from those Confederate guns above the ridgeline. Hill nonetheless said that, quote, the firing was beautiful, and it was the only instance he ever had known of infantry being broken by artillery fire at a long range. And again, probably an inaccurate assessment of what was actually happening. Now, for their part, the brigade sets off once again, and in Ezra Carmen's words, were, quote, in a beautiful line, as well dressed as on parade. Fairchild's men begin to ascend this gradual hill. The brigade now not even 700 men because of all the artillery and small arms fire that had started to take its toll. The Zouaves continued to move forward. Forward was the cry. They had a peculiar war cry, zoo, 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 that they supposedly were uttering as they began to move forward, again, trying to maintain some sense of cohesion, trying to maintain some sense of esprit de corps. Sergeants and corporals jostle men into position as small arms fire continues to disrupt the continuity of the men in the ranks. Yet all that training in New York City, all that hard fighting on Roanoke Island began to tell as the men showed their resolve at this critical moment. We may nonetheless ask, as is often asked on a Civil War battlefield, why did they not break? How did they continue to go forward? And I think we have a very interesting account from J.H.E. Whitney, who in 1866 publishes the Hawkins Zouaves. And his contention is this: I believe the fellowship, the gotten of army association, scarcely has its counterpart in any of the other relations of life. It is stronger than a threefold cord that cannot be broken. Your comrade in battle, your habitual file closer, your next hand man in the ranks, and most of all, your messmate and your bedfellow. They are your friends for life. And surely it must have felt so for these men on that day. Nonetheless, the line goes forward, and in Graham's words, began to shorten perceptibly. We could hear the crash of the missiles through the ranks. It seemed as though a flash came to Graham's mind, reminded him to quote, "I could hear the crash of bones in my division like glass in a hailstorm." And at this point, the assault begins to peter out. It loses its momentum. Its cohesion that had guided it for so long begins to dissolve. Company grade officers continue to shout encouragement, but the losses are becoming too great. One shell kills 8 men instantly in the ranks. Private Christian Bosom of Company H is cut in half by an artillery shell. They're harrowing scenes that the regiment encounters. At one point, Lieutenant Colonel Kimball excitedly points to one man and says, "A little nearer Company H, a man was wounded in the most frightful manner. The lower portion of his jaw had been carried off, and the torn fragments remained, together with his tongue, clotted with gore, hung down upon his breast. He sustained himself with one hand, while his other held his fez, or his hat, proudly in the air. 'Fallen but not conquered,' Graham said. 'See that? See that? Isn't that enough to make you fight?' he called to the men." It was on this ascent that Graham himself goes down, hit in the leg, a leg that he will eventually lose because of the severity of the wound. And then he recalled, quote, "We all went down together, although I was not hit with a bullet, but instead with grape shots. The losses had become fearful. The fronts of the companies had become so narrow that Graham finds himself right by the colors themselves. The color guard itself is being shot down. It's a scene of utter confusion. Methodically, as the description says, Sebastian Myers was the first to go in the color guard, and then Charles B. Hankinson, then David Van Cott and John B. Adair, and then another in the color guard. And hardly had John Fink of Company F grabbed the colors when he too fell stricken. And I don't think it's hyperbolic when they say the old flag was dyed in blood that day. The color guard died faithfully, performing their duty just as they had promised those men and women in New York City in the spring of 1861. And we have now reached the point where we started tonight's talk, when all seems lost. The colors have now repeatedly gone up and down, up and down. The sergeants and the corporals who compose that color guard are now either dead or wounded. The two flags, the red silk banner and the national flag, are on the ground, bloodstained. Leadership was needed. Courage was called for. At last, Captain Adolphe Libaire seizes the colors, as Ezra Carman writes. And then Captain Lawrence Leahy of one of the skirmish companies seizes the national colors. And together, the men start to move the regiment forward. Soon, Drayton's command is routed, some of the men are captured, and the rest begin to push toward Avy's Orchard. The actions of Libaire, Leahy, and others had inspired the regiment. Some of the Zouaves fought with such ferocity that they began to surge forward into Sharpsburg itself, where one of the members of the 9th is killed in the streets. And it's at this point, at the apex of this assault, and we'll go back to this flag, that the men become quite suddenly downtrodden. Why do we not continue to go forward? Where are the reinforcements that they had so desperately needed and wanted? The men begin to grumble in the ranks. It may be a bit of hyperbole, but Ezra Carman claims that some of the men began to cry, thinking that they couldn't continue with their assaults. Because the idea had been that at this point they will surge into Sharpsburg, they can see the rooftops in the horizon, and there push Lee's army back to the Potomac to seize that ultimate victory, which they had been so close to, but often lost. But it matters not, because the charge of the 9th New York was now over. Of the 373 men in action, 54 were killed, 158 were wounded, and 28 were missing, a staggering rate of more than 60%. The regiment later fell back to the Antietam Creek and subsequently recrossed and bivouacked high on the grounds below. And for the regiment's survivors, they had then to encounter perhaps the worst sights on any Civil War battlefield, and that's the aftermath, the carnage. Edward Brightman had not participated in the battle. 2 companies of the 9th were on detached service, but days afterward, he travels the field and writes to his brother, "Our dead still lay unburied, horribly mangled and lying in every conceivable attitude. Fences are everywhere broken, trees shattered, the ground plowed up in furrows, and everything testified to the terrible destructiveness of the agencies employed." The destruction for many was too great to comprehend. Let's get this in the sake of time. Sorry, Troy. For the members of the regiment themselves, Antietam will stick forever in their minds. One of the themes that many of the speakers tonight the course of this conference have rehearsed. Antietam had been indelibly etched in their minds. And they make a decision to create a monument, I'll go back to that image too, on the grounds where the charge had reached its apex. It's a grand monument. Blue granite from the quarries of Vermont. The base is 13.5 feet square, 3 feet in thickness. The main shaft some 40 feet in the air. And in May of 1897, a train left with 91 survivors of the 9th New York from Jersey City to Antietam for the purposes of conducting a monument dedication. Lieutenant Graham, who lost his leg that day, who had a tumultuous relationship with his wife in the post-war period, who was living alone by the 1890s, led the ceremonies. He called it, quote, our festival of our dead. This is a very curious phrase, the festival of our dead. He said, yes, though many eyes are clouded with tears, Though many hearts are heavy with regret, though many lives are still desolate because of the father or brother, the husband or lover do not come back, though every grave which we tender reverence or love adores with flowers is the shrine of sorrow whose influence is still potent. Despite it all, today is a festival of our dead. No less a festival because it is full of solemnity. And I'll say Graham's phrasing is unusual. It's corporeal. It's visceral. It focuses on death. It's unusual because at this same time of year, May 28th, May 25th, depending upon the date in this period of Memorial Day, the dead were often called noble. The speakers invoke images of sacrifice. Death is almost beautiful, as the dictates of the 19th century directed. Cyrus Simmons, who delivered a Memorial Day address at the Antietam battlefield in 1885, said that, quote, nature's hand had covered those ugly strifes of hate. The white stones only tell of war. Yet for the members of the Ninth, there's a certain ambiguity threaded through their messages on that day of remembrance. Rush Hawkins said that the crowd had all the conflicting emotions of pleasure and sadness which fill our hearts as we gaze upon faces once so familiar to us and recall to mind the many stirring scenes in the far-off past in which we participated. And now it came to the Ninth to dedicate a monument to a fight that they still said was ultimately a wasted opportunity. One of the speakers called it, quote, an awful day with unspeakable slaughter. He called McClellan, he said that McClellan, quote, committed a crime against a patriotic people whose blind confidence in incompetent leaders was only equaled by their ignorance of military affairs. Scathing. Scathing. And most importantly, this concept of our victory brought no perceptible result. Over 60% of the regiment's men had died that day, and the survivors were left wondering why. Why? One of the speakers, perhaps trying to set some sort of more lofty tone, said that ultimately it was providential. Slavery could not have been destroyed, he said, unless the war went on. And in his speech, he intoned, peace should not come to our land until the 4 millions of slaves held in bondage should be set free. Now, studies at Antietam have enjoyed something of a renaissance. Stephen Stottlemyre has written a very persuasive defense of McClellan's reputation in Too Useful to Sacrifice. Tom Clemens, Kevin Pollak, among others, AI members, also have questioned this prevailing orthodoxy. For me, though, in thinking about this talk, I sought not to engage really in the contested legacy of McClellan, but instead to understand something of Antietam through those who fought the battle, to venture with them across these fields, to come to understand how they represented this fight, what anxieties they eventually may have held. And while many of the survivors ultimately never met any sort of resolution at the Antietam battlefield during the monument dedication, they still had some key things to do together as a regiment. And with the blessing of New York Governor Theodore Roosevelt, on April 20th, 1899, they deposited their colors in the grand halls of the state capitol in Albany, New York. In 1861, Hawkins had said, quote, he was determined never to surrender the flag except with his life's blood. And the entire regiment was again pledged to stand by it at any cost and to bring it back unsullied by any taint of dishonor. The colors now were shot-torn, smoke-blackened, and bullet-riddled. They stood, in the words of one survivor, as mute emblems of the valor and heroism of the brave defenders. There's no record of it, but I can imagine these stoic men, these survivors, welled up with tears when they went to Albany to perform this task. The colors that had fallen and then been raised and fallen and then been raised and fallen and been raised at the apex of their assault at Antietam. The veterans now had to leave these colors forever. Graham solemnly remembered, quote, the time had come at last when they were to be finally and forever separated from their old colors. And while that connection may have been broken, another more powerful one remained. The chain forged upon the battlefield intoned Rush Hawkins at the Antietam ceremony, which binds together the men of the 9th New York, can never be broken. And it's this bond, I think, that guided tonight's presentation and very much shaped my understanding of this fight. And so I'll leave it then with the men of the 9th, and thank you for your time. Or questions? Yes.
Can you go back to the flag?
Yeah. Okay.
That was my question.
So yeah, sorry. The formatting here is a little sometimes hard for me to follow. So this is a flag that is almost guaranteed to have been carried at Antietam. As a young undergraduate, I actually interned at the New York State Military Museum. I saw the flag along with Elmer Ellsworth's uniform. But these are the tattered colors. It's red silk. You can see 9th Regiment emblazoned, the Toujours Pret, and the flag has been at this point so destroyed because of the military action that it's really almost half of what it once was. Again, a real testament to the ferocity of the fighting at Roanoke, but especially at Antietam. And again, I think today on that ridge, in that exposed position, you can get some real sense of how concentrated that Confederate fire must have been and how deadly those projectiles were as they're moving forward across those undulations.